Hier ist 8 Milliarden, der Auslandspodcast des Spiegel. Es ist Samstag, der 26. März 2022, der 31. Tag in Putins Krieg. This is 8 Billions, der Spiegels Foreign Affairs Podcast. It's Saturday, March 26, in the year 2022. It's the 31st day in Putins war. Sie hören eine Spezialfolge unseres Podcasts, die bis auf diese kurze Anmoderation auf Englisch stattfinden wird. Denn in dieser Folge senden wir die Neuauflage des Dreier-Interviews, das wir vor fast genau 2 Monaten veröffentlicht haben. Vor Russlands Invasion der Ukraine. Wir senden diese Folge weitgehend ungeschnitten, um den Interviewcharakter zu erhalten. Und das Interview selbst führen meine Kollegen Christoph Scheuermann, Christian Esch und Maximilian Popp. Zu Gast sind auch heute Masha Geesen, Nina Chruschtschow und Sabine Fischer. Und es geht um die Fragen, welchen Kurs Putins Russland nun eingeschlagen hat, wie sich die russische Gesellschaft unter seiner Herrschaft veränderte und was man von Russland und seinem Herrscher in den kommenden Monaten erwarten muss. You are listening to a special episode of this Spiegel podcast, which we air completely in English. And it is doubly special as this is a reprise of the same interview we aired almost exactly 2 months ago. We left this episode in a raw and only slightly edited state to conserve its character as a live interview. The talk is conducted by my colleagues Christoph Scheuermann, Christian Esch and Maximilian Popp. They'll be talking to Masha Geesen, Nina Chruschtschow and Sabine Fischer. All 3 of them qualify as experts on Russia, its people and its leader, Vladimir Putin.
All right. Nina, Sabine, as when we spoke in mid-January, the 2 or 3 of you and all of us thought it highly unlikely that Russia would invade Ukraine. Have we all underestimated how willing Putin is to use brutal military force in order to achieve his goals?
I think what I said at the time was that I thought a deliberate attack was not very likely, but an unintended escalation was actually increasingly likely. I think that was what I said at the time. So, I was rather pessimistic already in December, January. But since in January, the negotiations on the 2 draft treaties that the Russians had published in December were still ongoing. And actually, there was a lot of diplomatic activity between Russia and the West, the US, Germany, EU, NATO, etc. I thought that this was going to continue at least for some time and that maybe there was a chance for compromise. And this turned out to be a wrong assumption indeed. In terms of application of violence, I think, we knew already then that the Russian leadership, Vladimir Putin, that they do not hesitate to use violence and use brutal violence. We have seen that before in various wars, in Chechnya, in Syria, in Ukraine for that matter, because we discussed that already in 6 weeks ago. This is not, the war in Ukraine started in 2014. It didn't start in February 2022. So violence, I think nobody had any doubt that they use violence, but, the exact time and date, etc., yes, I don't think we expected that really.
I was absolutely shocked when it happened because half an hour before Putin gave his insane speech at 5 a.m. on February 24th, I thought that I was arguing that it cannot happen because it is against national interest, first of all, and second of all, he doesn't have the public support, and third of all, it is completely suicidal in terms of what Russia's future is going to be. Basically, it's almost like not only you shoot yourself in the foot, you basically take a cannon and shoot off all your legs up to the waist, and then sit in a wheelchair for the rest of your life. Why would anybody be doing this? So I was convinced that I was still arguing that Putin remains a political beast. So he's a tactical politician of sorts. I mean, obviously autocratic like authoritarian and almost dictatorial, but still a politician. What we learned on February 24th, because I still thought that on the 22nd, when they recognized the two republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, as independent entities, I thought, okay, that would be a proportional response to all the American insults and kind of hysteria that was going on and leaking information. I mean, clearly, that's, in my view, that's not how diplomacy is done. I continue to insist that that's not how diplomacy is done. And so Putin had to respond somehow because he's a strong man. He never gives up. He always shows that he has a muscle. But on the 24th, it became clear that his mind is a very different mind. He is a full-blown dictator, and something that actually Masha was more forcefully arguing than Sabine and I last time, that he's a full-blown dictator, that his geopolitical map has nothing to do with reality. It's sort of the worst version of a COVID syndrome when people are being closed enough and, for 2 years sitting at those giant tables. I mean, that should have been an indication that he's all alone, very isolated. And so he saw an entirely different map of the world that people in reality see. And it does seem, from what I've tried to analyze, it does seem he almost snapped, because there was some sort of negotiations and conversation, and then suddenly he said, well, you know what, forget it. If you want me to invade, I'm just going to invade. And that was supported, I think, by the fact that the military operation has not been going very well. We saw that because it didn't seem that they had all the pieces in place, because it does seem that the preparation, whatever that preparation was almost run like a clandestine operation. The economic team didn't know that it's going to happen. The FSB, the security forces, didn't know that it's going to happen. And some military knew something. So it seems to me that in a sense, is close to a palace coup or a government coup. But in a most bizarre way, it's the same man who created the contemporary Russia, sort of worked on it for 22 years, then decided in one swoop to kill it, to cancel it, to shoot it down and return Russia to some sort of Taliban or 11th century Orthodox tsardom that nobody even remembers what it was or used to be or even what was at all.
Just very quickly, Masha will join us in 3 minutes. She just emailed, so I think we'll just go on.
It's extremely interesting what you say, Nina.
Sabine, but if you have something to add,
yeah.
Go on.
Not really to add. I mean, I just want, or maybe yes, I wanted to add one thing because, I mean, my perspective was a little bit different in the days before the war started, also before the recognition, because I spent those days in Moscow. So I basically flew to Moscow to spend 1 week there before it all happened. And I talked to many people. And for me, it was really, fascinating to see how during that week the mood changed. Yeah, because I mean, at the beginning of that week, we had Chancellor Scholz's visit, which was on the 15th of February, which was the Tuesday, which was very well received actually in Moscow, also by colleagues I talked to, also hardliners, in the Russian foreign policy community, expert community. And they really saw this as a step forward, and they kept telling me there will be no war; it's all under control. This negotiation package that Putin had packed with the maximalist positions on the one hand, and rather reasonable demands and claims in terms of transparency and arms control and confidence building, etc., that this would be unpacked, unbundled at the end, and there would be compromise, and so on and so forth. And then on Thursday, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Russian MID, published its answers to the answers of the United States and NATO to the draft treaties on its website. And I read these documents, and I thought, this doesn't sound well at all. And then on Friday came the first news, the first reports about mass evacuation from the two territories in the Donbass. And for me, this was a clear sign that this was spiraling out of control. So I think, from Friday evening, actually, I was extremely pessimistic because, and then also, you had a barrage from Friday evening, actually, of news from the territories about alleged shelling from the Ukrainian side, bombs, etc., etc. So, also the propaganda turned around. There was an about face in the propaganda. The genocide narrative became very, very strong during those days. So that made me feel very pessimistic about the situation. And then when the recognition was announced, for me, this really felt like the next step in the direction of an escalation, really. So being in Moscow gave me a different perspective slightly during those days. And I just wanted to, this observation of, or this thought that there was a sort of palace coup, I'm not so sure about it. It's Putin anyway who takes the decisions. The economic bloc and also business people, they have been very far removed from the foreign policy decision-making process for many, many years. It's not that they were involved until the 24th of February and then blocked out. To me, the problems that Russia now has with its offensive, like the fact that the offensive is basically stuck in Ukraine, has more to do with a general lack of understanding and knowledge of the situation in the country, completely wrong assumptions with regard to potential Ukrainian resistance. I think this is a more general problem. It's not, I don't really see it as I don't see it as a consequence of bad preparation in the moment. I really think it's much more general.
Okay, I'd like to respond on the palace coup. Because I was not saying that there's a palace coup against Putin. I was saying
no, I understand.
We've never seen a man, because as you know very well, in the last 20 years, Russians lived better than ever before. The country that Russia was until February 22 was certainly restrictive, or have been becoming more and more restrictive, but it was much more prosperous than it ever was. So that was, in some ways, Putin's doing. So that very man turns around and says, don't like prosperity, it really doesn't work out for me. I'm going to fight with the West because that's my kind of Solzhenitsyn, Berdyaev, Ivan Ilyin, all these philosophers of immigrant philosophers that they concocted some sort of pan-Slavic nation, decided to put forward. So that's what I was saying. But also in terms of, so it is a one-man decision to go back to kind of pass by Ivan the Terrible and go even further in some sort of Christian Orthodox insanity. But also with the information that he received, absolutely, and that's why I was saying that FSB, the security, didn't think it was going to happen, because they were the ones feeding all this crap information about Ukraine, that they're going to, it's all Nazis, but they're going to, the Slavic brothers are going to surrender immediately. They too did not think that it's going to happen. And so the whole clandestine map of how it's going to play out was in Putin's head, and he was fed the information upon which he acted, but his other teams didn't think that the acting was happening. So it's not that we disagree. I just do think that we rarely see that one man cancels out 20 years of what he was trying to do and arguing he was doing, and then just decides that we're going to shoot off the legs.
Hello, Masha. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, I'm so sorry.
No, don't worry. No problem at all. We were just starting and thinking back of mid-January when we met last time. It seems just ages ago, although it was just 2 months ago. And we were asking ourselves whether at the time most of us, all of us, underestimated Putin's readiness to use brutal force against Ukraine, because when I think back of our last talk in mid-January, it was kind of, most of us thought that a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, including Kiev, would be kind of improbable. Did you have to rethink your own position on Putin, who he is or what he's ready to do?
I don't remember thinking that it was, I mean, I remember thinking it was improbable, but no, I definitely didn't think it was impossible.
Yeah.
Right. So I think, that it's whenever we deal with possible but improbable events, it's like the Trump election, right? Where we ran into trouble was thinking that it was impossible, right? And this clearly wasn't impossible. We had the necessary information. It was an improbable event that happened. I mean, I have to say my feeling about Putin's big war has always been that it was something that was on the horizon, but the question was, would he die first or start the big war first? And unfortunately, he started the big war first.
If we look at this war now, I mean, there's some kind of stalemate. What do you think will be the next phase in the war, and how will it continue in the coming days and weeks?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a great fan of journalists making predictions. I don't think we're well equipped to do that. What I think we do know is that Putin is not somebody who backs off. If he does back off, it's always a pause. It's not actually backing off. So what I think I can say with near certainty is if there is some kind of ceasefire, and even if there's some kind of peace agreement, it will be temporary, right? It will be a pause for him to regroup and strike again. I don't understand what's going on with the use of air power. I'm hoping that military experts can shed some light on it. I mean, I covered both wars in Chechnya, and the sort of the modus operandi is the same. It's just terrorizing the civilian population and basically a scorched earth policy. I don't understand why they're not using more air power or why they haven't pulverized Kiev. I'm glad they haven't pulverized Kiev, but I don't understand why this hasn't happened, and this concerns me greatly because it obviously could happen unless there's something we don't know.
I mean, honestly, I don't really see a stalemate yet. I think the situation is still dynamic, and we see Russian troops trying to move on, Mariupol anyway, but also Mykolaiv, and then, with regard to, or in the direction of Odessa, we see attempts to encircle Kiev, and we see movement in the east, and of course Ukrainians resisting and also, counterattacking. So I think right now, I think the situation is still too dynamic to speak of a stalemate. And it's really, I mean, one of my big fears, I have several, but one of them is that this is now really going to turn into a war of attrition that will cost civilians' lives in huge numbers, and that will exhaust. I mean, I'm sorry to say it, but I'm less worried about the Russian side here, but that will exhaust Ukraine's capabilities and ability to resist. So this is my biggest fear, and I fear that because, I mean, the Ukrainians, what they did over the past 4 weeks, no one expected that, really. I mean, who would have expected that Ukraine fights back and basically brings Russia's offensive, if not to a complete standstill, then, or at least slows it down to such an extent that Russia really gets into problems militarily. So the question is, and I don't really see the Ukrainian side balk. They insist on their positions in the negotiations. They fight back. So stalemate and ceasefire negotiations. I think what we will see is a very protracted process with many more casualties.
I actually, I have to say, the Ukrainian fighting back completely didn't surprise me, or doesn't surprise me at all. In fact, what surprised me more is that how Putin, who talks about World War II all the time and how heroic the Soviet forces were, and how we are so talking about Ukraine as it's the same nation and whatnot. How does he not know that Ukraine suffered a tremendous amount and fought like hell during World War II? And so imagining that the Russian occupiers would walk in and Ukraine is going to meet them with open arms, it just amazes me how little he would know, would understand at this point with his own geopolitical map in his mind. But also that goes back to my point about the clandestine operation and whatever that security forces clearly fed him what he expected to know, because anybody, and I have some Ukrainian blood, anybody who knows anything about Ukraine would know that they are not going to surrender. And like Sabina, that worries me, because it is going to be a long fight. And as Masha said, obviously very correctly, is that even if Putin decides to step back for whatever reason, it's not going to be over. I mean, that Odessa fight is still on the horizon, even if it's not this time around. So that is going to be a long war, even if this particular fight right now got less hot. But another thing that, now 10 million people have been misplaced, probably 5 million fled. There would be more millions to flee before it's over. So Ukraine is a nation of 45 million. How many Ukrainians would be left there to actually continue to fight or continue to be Ukrainians and continue to stand up for the nation? And that could be that war of attrition that Sabine is talking about. There would be fewer Ukrainians and some of them would be pro-Russian, although I don't see how anybody who is on territory in Ukraine right now could be pro-Russian in any shape or form, even if they were before February 24th.
No, I agree. I think the impact on Ukrainian society is huge. I think it was a completely wrong assumption on the Russian side, what you already said, Nina, that, that the real Ukrainians would just drive out the fascists and then welcome the Russians, and thank them for taking them home. That, of course, was a complete miscalculation. But still, I think, this war, in terms of Ukrainian nation building, we are in a completely different dimension now, which will be a huge problem for Russia also in the medium and long term, I think.
Is it thinkable after what we've seen, after how this war has played out so far, that Russia ends up controlling the whole country? I
don't think so. Sorry, Nina, you wanted to respond? No? Okay. Also from the conversations I had in Moscow in the week before the war, when everybody said there will be no war, but if the Ukrainians attack us, then this will happen. Most people really talked about, it's terrible to say that, but most people really talked about division, So most people said it would be a huge risk for Russia to really venture into Western Ukraine because the resistance would be much too strong and there would be insurgency and we couldn't handle that. So the general scenario, or the most frequent scenario that people spoke about was a division of the country. So Russia would leave a kind of Ukrainian, in quotation marks, rump state in the West, and either occupy or control politically the rest of the country, with a pro-Russian government in Kiev and so on and so forth. And that already would be extremely costly for Russia. But occupying the whole country, I think, is just it would be impossible.
Can I just very quickly add here, or sort of suggest something? Because they were saying that, Russians are not going to go to West Ukraine, but they already have. So that's something that already happened. But another thing, always, I teach propaganda, so I always look at wording, which is quite a remarkable thing to look at this, especially in this conflict. I mean, actually, in every conflict, but this conflict since it's our preoccupation right now. So Peskov, the Putin spokesperson, kept saying, well, there's no war. Of course, there's no war. I think Medvedev, the Security Council deputy, said, well, we are the last people who would think about war, and then it happened. Of course, they call it special operation. So now they've been very forceful to say there will be no occupation. So once they're forceful to say there will be no occupation, I immediately start thinking maybe there's just something already in the works. They just call it something else. So I would think that it is possible with a different name, and that war of attrition or the occupation of attrition may still be a possibility.
I would add that the way that propaganda is working, and I think this reflects very much Putin's thinking and actually Russian public opinion, to the extent that we can even talk about Russian public opinion. Russia is not at war with Ukraine. In that sense, calling it a special military operation is internally consistent, right? It's part of a consistent picture of the world. Russia is at war with the United States. And that makes, I think that actually makes the question possibly the wrong question, right? It's not a question of whether Russia is going to try to occupy all of Ukraine. It's how Russia will continue to prosecute this war with the United States. And I think Russia will prosecute it in Western Ukraine and possibly in Poland.
Yes, completely. Because it is, and, although, of course, the goalposts are being moved all the time, what's the reason for the war, for the special operation? Is this and it's that and something else? And then Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, came out and essentially said, well, this special operation is for Russia to continue to be on the world stage. And it's not so much about Ukraine, it is about the confrontation with the West. So they are even open to say that. And that's why when at the beginning of this conversation, when I mentioned all these concocted philosophies of Solzhenitsyn and Ilyin and Berdyaev and all others, you may remember that them sitting in Paris or Geneva or Cavendish, Vermont, they were talking about, or some of them were talking about the battle between the Eurasianist and the Atlanticist. And it does seem that Vladimir Putin is playing out that philosophical dream of Russian immigrants in the West who were arriving in the West with great hopes that it's going to be whatever their dream of the West was, but then turn out to be different, or so they thought it would be different. And so I think that is a level of psychosis that were possible, as Masha said, it was improbable, but it was not impossible. And so it was improbable to think that somebody in the 21st century would actually take it at face value. But clearly it turned out not to be impossible. And it does seem to be what's driving at least one's man agenda.
But Masha, when you can I just ask you if you're saying this could be prosecuted in Poland as well? What do you mean exactly? How could this pan out? And given that Poland is a member of NATO, obviously, how would this play out?
Well, if you listen to Russian television, there's a lot of talk constantly about the use of Polish military airports to supply aid to Ukraine. Right, and I'm concluding that what they're discussing or what they're planning is a strike on one of the Polish military airports, and then that raises the question for NATO of whether they respond to it as an attack on Polish territorial integrity, or as Russia will frame it, for external consumption, a Ukrainian military target that happens to be located on Polish territory, and for domestic consumption as a Russian strike against NATO that finally proves that NATO is a sham.
This scenario that Masha just described, I think, again, what you said before, Masha, I think applies perfectly. I think it's not probable, but it's not impossible. Yeah. I mean, it would also, from a Russian perspective, imply direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia. And I think even in this situation, this is a threshold, which, even from a Russian perspective is difficult it's a line that they might not want to cross. This is why I didn't want to say before that Western Ukraine or Poland, for that matter, or, NATO and Central Eastern European countries in a more general sense are not in danger. I think they are. But I think the means could be different, the closer Russia Russian action gets to NATO boundaries, I think the more important deniability will be from a Russian perspective. So my assumption would be that, yes, there will be attacks. And in fact, there already are, but they will be hybrid. They will be deniable. And it will be much more complicated to really identify Russian attacks. A military strike against a Polish airport, this would be military confrontation between Russia and NATO. I think it would be very dangerous. I think they are still and probably will remain hesitant to do that. But hybrid attacks, that's nothing new. We've seen them in the past few years. And I think this will become, we will see many more of them, and this will intensify.
Has this... Just a personal question. In what ways has this war impacted your private contacts, your personal friendships, your work with or in Russia? Is that kind of a line that really a thing that has fundamentally changed also your personal связь, the personal connection to Russia?
That's a difficult question. I can start. I think I moved all my correspondences and conversations from WhatsApp to Signal, Trima, and other more secure platforms. That's for one. Of course, it has a great impact. I just said I was in Moscow in the week before the war. I lived there. From 2019 to 2021, I used to travel there. I don't know how many times per year, and I think this will become very difficult now. Maybe even impossible. So this is very difficult personally and also as a researcher. We will all have. It will become much more complicated also to collect data in Russia, to find sources that are really reliable. Independent media have been destroyed almost completely. Of course, the journalists, from Dost or Echo Moskwy or other independent medias, they are now trying to use the very few niches that are still there and set up their own YouTube channels and, try to continue to work. But also for them, it will become more and more difficult to really, do professional journalism. So collecting data, getting information, finding reliable sources, it will be very, very difficult and probably for quite a long time to come. So I think this is difficult on all levels, professionally, personally.
Nina, Masha, how has it affected your personal?
Well, probably Masha and I don't know if I can. I'm not going to speak for both of us, but we are Russians. I'm Russian. So it's not just about collecting data or having friends. It's family. I was supposed to go there on March 10th, and I couldn't because there was a travel ban, not travel ban, but travel warning, and I was afraid that I couldn't be back to teach at the end of the semester. But also, of course, we use Telegram channels, we use Signal, we have YouTube, so its information is available, and I talk to my family there all the time. But on another level, which not only, but probably Russians feel more than others right now, is that we are the country that dubbed ourselves the liberators of Europe in 1945. We helped to clean the world from fascism. And now with the pretense of fascism, we are the fascists of Europe. We are the ones that bombed those cities. I mean, Kiev hasn't been bombed too much, but we are destroying the country that, and my great-grandfather, in fact, helped to build after 1945, raised Kiev, raised Ukraine from the ashes. So that in itself is something that we are the new fascists of Europe is inconceivable and heartbreaking and embarrassing and shameful. And this is another psychological thing that, we talk about Ukrainians, what we do to them, but also what is going to do to us, to the Russians for decades to come. And that's another part that, only us, the Russians, would feel, because it goes much beyond personal, as I said, personal data collections and whatnot, because we are now the enemy of the world.
I flew to Moscow on the 24th, on February 24th, and I stayed there for a week. And during that week, everyone I knew in the city who could leave, and by could, I don't mean financially able to, I mean, the one close friend of mine who didn't leave is going through radiation and can't leave until her course of treatment is over, right? My entire world left. Everyone, every home that I was regularly a guest in, every young person who my children grew up with, my entire universe of reference in Russia has dispersed. There are no good estimates of how many people left in those couple of weeks right after the invasion began, but probably about at least 250,000.
Yeah.
And that's such a concentrated exodus, obviously incomparable to the 3.3 million refugees from Ukraine who are fleeing mortal danger, but we're talking about sort of the entire Russian civil society picking up and leaving the country. Everything that was left of independent media being chased into exile and being forced to close at the same time. And not only being forced to close, but having to delete all traces of their existence, right? Having to take their sites down, having to hide their YouTube channels, having to hide their social media presence in order to avoid endangering people who, left a comment or that sort of thing. So it's like a world that just vanished in the course of a couple of weeks. And watching that happen, I physically traveled with the TV Rain people. I physically ran out of the office with them when I was about to get raided, and then physically got on a plane with them, and then on another plane, and then, but also watched them deleting their presence from the virtual universe. And so that's the personal part, and it's just completely devastating to me and to everyone I know. Literally to everyone I know. And there's the professional part, which is that I was able, for the last 8 years that I've lived in exile, to not only, this is an amazing luxury, I was able to travel back and forth, but also I was able to report based on sort of a very large curated social media presence, and because I was calling people, and because I was watching both independent and state media, right? Now, basically, all of those instruments are either gone or significantly hampered, including state media. It's now actually much harder for me to sit here in New York and watch Russian television because of American sanctions. And in addition to that, the entire Western press corps has left. I think there's one guy left, a BBC reporter who is married to a Russian who is refusing to leave. But that is unprecedented. That's not even Soviet level. That's not even Stalinist level. That's like North Korea level. Right? To not have any Western journalists.
Well, there is a Spiegel correspondent now there. Me personally, I'm not there, but there's our colleague, right. And there are some German correspondents at the moment there.
And are they staying? Because all the U.S. media have pulled all of their reporters.
The problem is that it's very difficult to say how we are going forward, because doing your work as you used to do is legally you may run into legal problems. But so far, a chunk of German correspondence is still there.
How much do the Russians get to know about this war? And what do they hear about the war? Because, Masha, I listened to your podcast with Ezra Klein, where you described the first days of the invasion, and it sounded completely surreal, as if this war wouldn't take place in, the Russian public.
Well, that information is a little bit out of date. Now it's harder for me to say what people are saying for all the reasons that I just mentioned. But certainly what was happening in the first couple of weeks was not only that that people weren't seeing the images of carnage and that state media weren't calling it a war, right? It was special military operation, special operation to seize hostilities, special operation to bring peace. There are all sorts of nomenclature floating around. But the most interesting part for me was the sort of the tone and the pacing of the news, which is much harder to convey, because it's not just what things are called. It's that nothing out of the ordinary was happening on Russian TV, right? The newscast was 5 minutes long at the top of the hour. They have the talk shows where they go at it and they sort of try out all their talking points about Ukraine. But the talk shows have been around for a very long time, and they have always been at a fever pitch. In fact, I thought they were a little bit less anxious sounding than they had been in past years, certainly around the time of Crimea. They were much more kind of confident and measured. But then also the context, like, for example, they would say, they would have a report on Mariupol, right, on claiming that Ukrainians were using people as a human shield in Mariupol, and manufacturing in advance evidence of Russian war crimes, falsifying evidence of Russian war crimes. But then the next item would be a Romanian rescue plane crashed while on a mission to in the mountains. 7 people died, right? And so so there was a kind of routine feeling to this. And then there would be a long broadcast on all the measures that the government is taking to repair the economy in the face of unwarranted unmotivated anti-Russian sanctions. So it's completely surreal, and it's an entirely different world. It's a world in which the big war doesn't exist.
There are also a lot of people in the cities, the ones that protest, the one that Masha described, many who by now left. They were, and those who are still there, the Telegram channels are being used. There's still YouTube channels that are available. So there are blogs, and there are also the VPNs that now everybody's using. So information is available. But these are city people. These are the people who kind of have access to the world in many ways. But there are also smaller places and villages. And there was actually just various people went to Samara or to Voronezh, which is not that far from where the battles take place. And they're buying people watch TV. They don't go into the internet because they say it's all fake news. It's all bloggers, and bloggers are not real journalists. We trust our own information. And so the own information, the whole propaganda is just totally in overdrive, because we, the Russians, defend those poor Slavs. And of course, we're saving them. So none of the footage that where Ukrainians are running away and trying to flee from the Russian onslaught really are not there on TV. It's all about the targeted military operation, and no civilian has been hurt in the shooting of that propaganda video, and so on and so forth. And in the depth of Russia, which is, let's remember it's 11 time zones, in the depths of Russia, where people had less access to kind of global community, even in all this reasonably free years, it's still very much a message, and, very much that Putin will defend us. It is interesting that, we all grew up in the Soviet Union and learned not to trust the Soviet propaganda, and somehow Russian propaganda, with all its gimmicks and Putin bare-chested, although he hasn't been that way for quite some time, somehow becomes more convincing. Or I would also kind of conclude with, in a post-truth environment, people just choose what they want to believe. We don't want to believe that we invade or attack Ukraine, so we want to believe that we defend it. And people will go very far to have confirmation, sort of this kind of a confirmation bias, to believe what they want to believe, to make themselves feel better, even especially at the time of such uncertainty.
Can I add one thought about people in Russia who are against the war, unhappy with this war, and cannot leave? Because there are many of them, actually. I mean, Masha, you described the exodus, and I mean, it's mind-boggling, really. And I mean, also, from my friends and also colleagues whom I used to, socialize with in Moscow, in Petersburg, so many have left. I mean, for me, this is a completely different situation. The situation now that from my experience in all the years before that, I have been working on Russia, living in Russia, etc. But at the same time, I mean, some people just cannot leave, and there are quite a few of them, because either they don't have the money, or they have family, or they are looking after elderly, parents, etc. They cannot leave. And these people now find themselves in what I would call double isolation, because not only are they isolated, marginalized, and increasingly threatened, physically in Russia, because the environment has turned into something that is much more hostile than it used to be before 24th of February, because of repressions, because of the propaganda, etc., etc. They are now also isolated from, their main reference point, which still is the West. And by the sanctions, by, the impossibility to travel there, and so on and so forth. So these people are really in a very, very difficult and precarious situation now. It's very hard.
How will this war change Russia? Is the country turning into some sort of fascist regime?
It has already changed Russia, right? And it has already, I think we're no longer talking about the future. I mean, it's been my thesis for a number of years that Russia has restored totalitarianism. And if we use the classic Arendtian definition of totalitarianism, it rests on ideology and terror. And I think that the shift that has happened is that where terror was, there was a great economy of terror before the big invasion, right? It certainly existed, right? I mean, there's no other name for using chemical weapons against the regime's opponents, right? There was terror, but it was almost homeopathic. It was extremely directed, and when it wasn't directed, it was still on a small scale. When random protesters were prosecuted, it would always be one or two out of tens of thousands. Right? That's the change. The change is that we're actually going into non-economical and uneconomical regime of terror. And we're seeing that it's going to be harder to see because it's becoming much more difficult to keep track of political prosecutions. It's something, and that's a big change that just happened in the first week of the invasion. There were too many arrests. There were, the organizations like Over the Info, which had done such a terrific job for 10 years of tracking basically every single political prosecution. They ran out of lawyers. They ran out of resources. They could no longer track people who are being held in jails. We just now, yesterday got news of a really horrible case of a young man who was held for 2 weeks. Nobody could find him, and he finally committed suicide. But it's going to be, from what we can tell, the prosecutions under the new law against fakes that provides for up to 15 years in prison are already starting. I am almost certain that prosecutions under the dormant espionage law have also started. We've always had a harder time keeping track of prosecutions for high treason or espionage. They tend to be much less public, and they tend to target people who are not on the human rights organizations' radars. But the prosecutor's office said on February 25th, I think, that they're going to start applying this dormant article of the law that basically allows them to target anybody, and I'm sure they have, right? So I think that terror has already started, and we're going to start to recognize the scale of it in the coming months.
Yeah, I'm afraid I agree with that. I mean, I find myself using the words dictatorship and terror very regularly, which is really, really, really frightening. And I mean, in this context and with a view to terror, let's not forget that Russia is now no longer a member of the Council of Europe. And I only want to quote the really blood-curdling statement by Dmitry Medvedev during the first week of the war when, the discussion about the membership in the Council of Europe started. And he said, well, when we're no longer a member, we can also just reconsider the moratorium on the death penalty, which is a very, very frightening thought, I think,
And also Russia doesn't have a moratorium on the death penalty.
It does.
That's a very common, misconception. So Russia never ratified Article 6 of the Council of Europe Charter, and Russia they basically put a pause on the death penalty. Yeah, they stopped enforcing it. They never took it out of the penal code, and they never passed a moratorium. So revoking it is an administrative act.
Exactly.
They don't even have to take it to parliament.
I mean, it was a precondition at the time, both for the partnership and cooperation agreement with the European Union and for the membership in the Council of Europe. But it's true, it's an administrative act, so it could be done very quickly. That's true. I wanted to add one thought. I mean, I don't know how Masha and Nina, how you see that, but I mean, with the sanctions and this war, which is probably going to turn into a war of attrition, so it will have huge costs for Russia, etc., etc. I mean, my feeling is that the pressure is so strong now, and it will become even stronger, that I don't know. I mean, for the first time in 20 years of Putin's rule, I have the feeling that there could be a tipping point when it's just too much, So I really increasingly feel that we're moving closer to a point when internal change is inevitable because the pressure is becoming too strong. Then what kind of change that will be is another question, of course. But I think the situation as such could amount to something that will really could become dangerous for Putin's rule.
I think it's a more and more conversation, but we've been having that conversation for a long, long time. Possibly, but I wouldn't, even without Putin, I would not disregard the existence and continuation of the system, because at this point, the Lavrentiy Beria fate may await him. That's possible. But he has created or strengthened the system of governance, which is the security forces, the FSB system of governance that is not going to go away because they are not going to have the new redistribution of wealth and whatnot. So it may become less toxic, but and conversation has been going on. But it doesn't mean that the system would would collapse. So that's something that we should also remember, that they are not going to give power that much. And with Beria, it was lucky because then the leadership then, post-Stalin, decided that being scolded on the red carpet by the communists is better than being hung by on the trees by the KGB. This time around, I'm not sure, but that'll go back to my kind of original point that the FSB was feeding Putin certain type of information, and they were very upset, what I was told by higher-ups, that they were very upset that this thing happened. And yet how quickly something we've just discussed, the complete elimination of civil society, independent media, whatever was left of it, and so on, how quickly they moved in with their own agenda. So they may not want the war in Ukraine, but they're certainly using it as an opportunity to strengthen their own force. So Putin, yes, but it's also, I think, a great deal of wishful thinking that suddenly just we are going to turn and it will be desalinization or deputinization and we'll move forward to the more open world. I mean, it is a wonderful possibility, but I just don't think that whatever that strengthening of is that Putin has been very deliberately working on for at least last 10, 15 years, they are going to give up easily and quickly because they know what's at stake if they are no longer in charge, and they are not going to give that power.
I mean, I think that one lesson that we can learn from the mid-1950s was that from what we know now, there was more opportunity for change there than anybody recognized at the time. Right. And I think that after Putin goes, there will be a period of profound instability. Right. I'm not sure that I'm not sure how much of a factor his cronies' desire to hold on to money and power is going to be, just because it's going to be so chaotic, because it's such a one-person structure, but that's sometime in the future. My problem intellectually is that I don't see the path from here to there, except for his death. Right? I agree that this is probably the final chapter of the Putin regime, but I don't know how long this chapter is going to last, because I don't see any of the sort of the traditional analysis of, the elites are going to coalesce and stage a palace coup. I don't believe in that for a second. That's that involves a fundamental misunderstanding of how the regime works. The regime works by being completely focused on Putin, and on Putin being the distributor of money and power at all times. So the smaller the pie gets, the less possibility of solidarity there is in the elites. And I don't, the masses are not going to rise up. The masses are living in a state of terror. And this, we know how that works in that particular country under that particular kind of regime, right? So I don't think there's any reason to entertain any illusions there. So as brittle as the regime becomes after this incredibly, insane act of aggression, I don't know what the thing that's going to take advantage of the brittleness is going to be, other than the dictator's death.
What then does that mean to us in the West? I mean, knowing that the final chapter can take a long time, what actions should we take in the West towards how should we define our relationship to this, or our actions towards this regime?
In some ways, I think there have been some positive changes. I'm also really concerned about how it's playing out. There's, we very quickly went from sanctions, devastating economic sanctions, to something entirely different, which is a kind of spontaneous capitalist boycott of Russia. And the problem with that, I think, is that it's not a matter of policy. And so it's very difficult to discuss as a matter of policy. And I think it needs to be discussed as a matter of policy. And it needs to be discussed as a matter of moral policy. Right? At the moment, this profound economic boycott is affecting the Russian poor more than anybody else. And that's about half the population. About half the population spends the majority of their income on food. And they're already starting to feel absolutely devastating effects, while the lifeblood of the regime continues to flow, with Western Europe and the United States continuing to buy energy from Russia. And as a matter of policy, if we think of it as a matter of policy, it's profoundly immoral. And so, I think what the West needs to do is stop celebrating the devastation that it is inflicting on Russia and start talking about the values at the basis of this devastation, right? I don't see a way out of it without devastating the Russian economy, or I don't see a way for the West to behave, but there has to be something other than vengeance and meanness driving this, and it has to be a matter of policy and not sort of popular behavior.
You couldn't have said it better, because I was just in Vienna, and there was a Tolstoy, either library or I forgot, whatever it is, put the Tolstoy picture on the wall, and it was graffiti was all over it, and there were Pushkin portraits in the garbage in libraries all over Europe. And this is something that is new, because, even with Nazi Germany, German music, Bach existed and Beethoven existed, and suddenly Tchaikovsky concert is being forbidden in Berlin. So this is something, that kind of great celebration of punishing Russia for Putin's behavior is something that, in fact, for many, proves his propaganda points, that the West is out to get us, and they don't respect us, and I've been right all along, and no wonder we fight them, because they are doing this and that. And something else that Masha said, and I know it from my own family experience, those in the Kremlin are always going to be fine. The country can starve to death, they're going to be fine, but the country will starve to death. And so instead of doing that blanket sanctions, blanket sanctions are important, they still need to be policy related. They need to be targeted, not the way targeted, we target Deripaska, but we don't target Abramovich or something. They should be targeted, but targeted, and even I think James Psaki and Liz Truss and all these people who speak on behalf of diplomacy said, well, unfortunately, Victoria Nuland, unfortunately, the Russians would have to suffer. Well, that for now, and Masha is absolutely correct in saying, he can die, but we don't know how that last cycle will last. The final cycle will last. Is that for at least for the near future, that can in fact make people rally around the flag rather than the other way around. And so in creating sanctions and also targeting people in kind of social and cultural disconnect from everything is something worth considering. I don't know who does those things, but maybe on a popular level, it shouldn't be such a celebration of how we punish Russia, because it really is not going to bring positive results, I believe.
Okay, I think I have a slightly different background here, because, in Germany, honestly, I think I actually don't see people celebrating the sanctions. That may be different in the American debate. I think in Germany, there's a lot of worry, a lot of concern also about Russian society. specifically civil society, of course, and people who are critical towards the regime and are against this war, but also in a more general sense. So I think the debate here is a little bit different. But I wanted to add another point because, agreeing to basically everything that Masha and Nina said. I mean, to me, this question is also very closely linked to the actual war Russia is now waging against Ukraine and its results. And I think it is an essential interest from our perspective to help and support Ukraine to preserve its statehood. Because this is what this is really about. I mean, this war is being waged to destroy Ukraine as a state. And it is in our core interest to help Ukraine. And I mean, I'm phrasing this exactly like this, which is tragic because we cannot really, interfere with the war, because this would really mean a war between NATO and Russia, but to help Ukraine prevent this. So everything that is being done in terms of support for Ukraine, politically, economically, in terms of weapons supply, etc., is incredibly important, also in our relationship with Russia, I think. And this leads to, the discussion about deterrence. I think by now it is clear to almost everybody that the security order in Europe is shifting from cooperative to confrontational. So we need to prepare for this. And the third point that I wanted to make is about our relationship with Russian society. I mean, this is something that still matters a lot. And this now implies, of course, support and work with the Russian diaspora in Western Europe, which is growing by the day. We talked about the reasons. But I think we need to keep trying to carve out niches to work with people in Russia. I mean, this is incredibly difficult, if not as good as impossible right now. But we need to keep thinking about this and trying to do it.
Well, we do. And yet, for example, the British scientists decided they're not going to work with the Russian scientists, or the Nordic Council canceled relationship with the Moscow pen. So it is, once again, yes, we do, but emotionally nobody wants to, because it is the price of an empire. It's not just Putin's war, it becomes an imperial war. And if it's an imperial war, then all the Russians are guilty of that. And I think that hopefully can change at least a little bit, because since we keep going to the 50s, it is when the scientific and cultural relationship were the beginning of opening the Soviet Union to the West. Now, unfortunately, we're going the other way around for no reason whatsoever. As Masha said, the psycho decision of one man. But this really should not be stopped, because the more restrictive the relationship are, and the longer they are restrictive, the worse it is for Russia's future.
But I mean, that also requires some discernment, right?
Yes.
On the one hand, American and other Western universities and cultural organizations are suddenly, waking up to dealing with Russia. On the other hand, why was Columbia University, for example, taking huge grants from the Russian Culture Ministry for translating Russian literature into English? Really, Columbia University can't afford to translate Russian literature without Russian state funding? And the problem with this is that this applies across the board to cultural and scholarly, scientific and academic exchanges, where the people actually have to be discerning, have to separate state money from non-state money, state-sponsored candidates from independent candidates. That requires a fair amount of work that bureaucracies are generally not very good at. So I instead of arguing for maintaining all cultural and academic exchanges, I would argue for changing the policy on cultural and academic exchanges to support Russian civil society and to stop supporting the state.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to give one example in this area, the German Academic Exchange Service, like basically everybody else in the days after the war, decided to suspend all interaction with the Russian side, and later on then adjusted its position and announced that they would continue to support individual Russian researchers, with grants, working in Germany, etc., but keep the cooperation, for instance, with Russian universities suspended. And this is, I think, a very sound and actually even wise decision. Yeah, and this is, in my view, exactly the direction that we need to go to.
I have to go, if I may. I apologize.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nina, Sabine, and Masha. I think we've taken already enough of your time. Thanks so much.
And apologies again for being late.
No worries, Masha. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.